Akwaba, welcome to this week's edition of Ghana African Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, entrepreneur, and podcaster. And in this week's episode of Ghana African Focus is a special. We are looking about it's Africa Liberation Day, but we're looking at liberation from a different standpoint today, because today we'll be talking about the Uyghur people in China. And we have a very special guest who is an independence leader advocating for the restoration of East Turkistan's independence. He's also the founder and president of the East Turkistan National Awakening Movement. He's also the prime minister of the East Turkistan Government in exile between 2019 and 2023. And he's currently the foreign minister of the same government since November of 2023. So he's a frequent speaker in the United States congressional advocacy, human rights forums, and international media. So my guest, Salih, is one of the loudest and most uncompromising voices in the global Uyghur movement. And like some Uyghur organizations that push for cultural rights or autonomy, he explicitly demands full statehood for East Turkestan and frames the struggle as anti-colonial. And so, without further ado, my special guest today is Salih Hudayar, as I mentioned, former Prime Minister of East Turkestan. All right, so I'm very privileged and humble that you've agreed to be my guest on Ghana African Focus. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great stuff. So, for listeners unfamiliar with your history, who are the Uyghur people?
So the Uyghurs are the ethnic Turkic people. Actually, we're a hybrid nation of the original Indo-European peoples who have inhabited Central Asia since the end of the Ice Age, according to archaeologists and genetic research, as well as the Turkic peoples who have also inhabited East Turkestan and surrounding areas since over 6,000 years. So we are the hybrid of these two distinct peoples. And we have been inhabiting in East Turkestan, as I mentioned, for thousands of years. Part of our ancestry from since the Ice Age to part of our ancestry since about 6,000 years. So we are the native peoples of East Turkestan. The Chinese, you might have heard us in the media about China, targeting Uyghurs for and mass internment, discrimination, all these different things, and genocide. China is doing this specifically. The media says, China is targeting Chinese Muslims. Firstly, we're not Chinese in any way. Ethnically, as I just mentioned, we're Indo-European and Turkic.
Okay.
We have no cultural, religious, or whatever ties with the Chinese.
Right.
And the persecution of our people is not religiously motivated. It's actually because of China's imperialistic, colonial nature. Because we are not Chinese, this is why we are being targeted.
Right. Okay. So we'll get into that in a bit more detail. So for my listeners who may not know where East Turkestan is, could you say where it is and what is its historical relationship with Central Asia?
So East Turkestan is the eastern part of what was historically known as Turkestan, which refers to the broader Central Asian region up until really the 1700s. The whole of Central Asia from the 6th century onwards was known as Turkestan because the majority of the people here were Turkic, and it was also Turkestan comes from the Turkic Khaganate, which emerged in the 6th century.
Right.
So this was what Turkestan is. Turkestan began becoming defined as East and West around the 1730s, especially with the Russian Empire's expansion into Central Asia, into West Turkestan. And then so this is where East and West Turkestan became delineated to describe the territories that were under or that were being encroached by the Russian Empire versus the ones that were independent. Then later, East Turkestan became annexed, invaded by the Manchu Qing Empire and ruled as a colony for about from 1759 till 1863. We briefly declared our independence in 1864 up until 1877 when the Russians supported the Manchu Qing Empire to invade us once more. So East Turkestan today is known by the Chinese as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Right.
In fact, 1955 is when China designated us as the so-called autonomous region to deny, to give the false impression that we have, our people have some form of self-rule, when in reality it's just a paper designation that China uses to deny our right to self-determination.
Okay.
Between 1884 is when the Qing Empire formally tried to annex East Turkestan into its empire as Xinjiang, meaning the new territory. Or if you look at the 1887 dictionary, Chinese English dictionary, that was put out by the Qing Empire itself, compiled by the Qing Empire's officials, it literally translates this as the colony. So
Right.
the name Xinjiang itself shows that we are not part of China, that this is a colonial, occupation, what is happening in East Turkestan.
Right.
However, even after 1884, we persistently struggled to, resist the Chinese colonial occupation. We've succeeded in liberating and declaring our independence in 1933 as the East Turkestan Republic, but it was short-lived due to Soviet intervention. In 1944, we declared our independence again as the East Turkestan Republic for the second time. And in 1949, again, with the Soviet Union's assistance for the Chinese communists, they invaded our country and occupied it. After the Soviet Union helped China in assassinating top leadership of our leadership in a so-called plane crash, and then the remaining military, political officials, senior officials were killed were assassinated through various means.
Right.
Some were staged as car accidents and so forth, things like this.
Okay, so moving on then, and it sort of ties in with part of what you said. How would you then describe your people's cultural, linguistic, and religious identity?
So our people, culturally and linguistically, are close to that of Central Asia. We are Turkic people. We're a Central Asian people. Linguistically and culturally, the closest ethnic group right now that we would be the most closest to, as in terms of Uyghurs, is the Uzbeks. In fact, Uzbeks and Uyghurs, we are pretty much, you could say, the same people separated by a border. And the divide and conquer strategy of the Russian Empire, delimiting us as, you're Uyghur, you're Uzbek, you're this, you're that, when in reality, we're all Turkic peoples.
Right.
Religiously, majority of our people today practice Islam, about 98% or so. But historically, we practiced pretty much every major religion out there, everything from Zoroastrianism to shamanism to Taoism to Buddhism to Nestorian Christianity, and then since the 10th century, Islam.
So would you say that you are Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims?
So I think our people are Sunni Muslims,
right?
Because we don't really have a Shia sect there.
Right. Okay, so interesting. Now we're going to move the conversation on to establish the colonial framework as to what you're fighting for and why you're fighting for. So essentially, when and how did the Chinese state incorporate East Turkestan? And at this point, we're not talking about every single Chinese people, but we're talking about the Chinese state specifically, because obviously they are the ones who want to impose this colonial imperialism on your people. So again, when and how did the Chinese incorporate East Turkestan?
So to get back to this, we have to go back to 1884. So as I mentioned earlier, 1884 is when the Manchu Qing Empire designated, tried to annex East Turkestan and designated
Right.
it as Xinjiang, meaning the colony or the new territory.
Right.
However, the Manchu Qing Empire, was also an empire that was occupying China, as well as Mongolia, as well as Tibet, in addition to us. So in 1912, the Manchu Qing Empire was overthrown by the Chinese nationalists during the Chinese Revolution. And immediately afterward, even during that time, we tried to declare our independence, but there was issues within, East Turkestan, various warlords fighting against one another, competing for influence and so forth. And the Chinese didn't, after the Qing Empire collapsed, the Chinese didn't have any, control over East Turkestan in that sense. No Chinese central government had any control. To the point that the founder of modern China, or the father of the Chinese Revolution, both the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists, they view him as, the main Chinese leader. And his name is Sun Yat-sen. In 1921, he wrote a book called The International Development of China. And in that book, he had a specific chapter called The Colonization of Mongolia and Xinjiang. Xinjiang is the older English term for Xinjiang, or the Chinese colonial term, which they used to refer to East Turkestan.
Right.
And in it, he specifically states that China needs to. It's of greater, national interest of China, of the utmost importance, to colonize East Turkestan by settling some 10 million Chinese settlers, and to get our resources. So this is essentially when the Chinese began to plan their colonization, planning for the occupation and colonization of East Turkestan. So as I mentioned earlier, we had brief periods where even after the 1930s, the Soviets intervened. East Turkestan was governed by a Chinese warlord that was close to the Soviet Union. So he wasn't really tied to the Chinese state. He was more of a Soviet puppet. Then 1944, we declared our independence. 1949, Mao and Stalin, they come to an agreement that, Stalin was worried that because of East Turkestan's location, because if you look at the map behind me, we border India to the south, Pakistan, Afghanistan to the west is Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Tajikistan, not Uzbekistan. To the north is Russia. To the east is Mongolia, China, and Tibet. So Stalin was worried that if we remained independent, because we border, Pakistan and India, which were still under British influence, that the British could use East Turkestan as a potential. We'd end up getting too close to the British, and we might end up pressuring both the Soviet Union and China. So Stalin advised Mao to occupy East Turkestan. And the only reason why the Soviet Union could have easily occupied us if it wanted to, but again, it didn't want to share a border, have a border between us and India. So it wanted us to be serving as a buffer. So Stalin ordered Mao, to occupy East Turkestan, and that was the phase. And Stalin provided all the necessary tools, including airlifting hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, assassinating many of our core leadership in a so-called plane crash, and then assassinating other senior military and political leaders in order to prevent an effective resistance. So on October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the People's Republic of China. Then on October 12th, 1949, 11 days later, he ordered the Chinese invasion of East Turkestan. So the Chinese invaded East Turkestan on October 12th. And then on December 22nd, 1949, is when they formally overthrew our government, the East Turkestan Republic, and began occupying. But again, using the narrative that, they respect our right to self-determination, because these were the communists' promise in the 1930s, 40s. They're like, oh, we support the right to self-determination, even to the point that the Chinese communists in 1931, in their constitution, they had written that all the former non-Chinese peoples and areas of the former Qing Empire, the Manchu Qing Empire, had the right to complete separation and independence if they wanted, if they chose that. So that was a promise, that was enshrined. But later, after occupying East Turkestan, they obviously, they're not going to keep that promise, because the whole goal is just to colonize us through these false promises. Then in 1955, after after 5 years, our leaders were like, all right, we'd like you to leave. Thank you. Our remaining leaders were like, we'd like you to leave. Thank you. We can take care of, developing and modernizing ourselves. And they're like, oh, no. We're going to give you an autonomous, autonomy, not independence. So this is where the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region framework came.
Right.
However, even with that, our leaders rejected the autonomous designation and said, no, we don't want your autonomy. We don't want you to colonize our country. You need to leave. We can do everything on our own. To where in 1957, 58, they began the mass purge of all of these leaders, even in the autonomous regions government. Over 1,600 top leaders were purged as ethnic nationalists. Many of them were executed and imprisoned.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very interesting overview you've given there. So based upon that whole, you could say, illegal occupation of East Turkestan, what then were the political or economic motives behind this takeover? Are they resources in your country? Was that the basis for their takeover?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was both political and economic because of the geostrategic. One of the main reasons was Stalin, was afraid that we'd end up becoming too close with the British, and the British would end up using East Turkestan as a base to put pressure on both the Soviet Union and China. So this is something that he felt was unacceptable. Secondly, East Turkestan, we are a huge land area, 1,828,418 square kilometers, or if we can put it in a roughly about a quarter of what is now, what many people claim or know as China, or what the PRC claims is China. So over a quarter of that. Over 30% of China's oil and natural gas comes from East Turkestan.
Wow.
Over 40% of the coal reserves, about 20% of critical and rare earth minerals comes from East Turkestan. The electricity from East Turkestan produced in East Turkestan powers over 120 Chinese cities in 20 different Chinese provinces. So it is very rich. Over 90% of China's cotton production comes from East Turkestan as well. This is why the Chinese government is mass, enslaving our people right now, using them.
So would you say then, given that, would you say that East Turkestan is central to the economic development and prosperity of China?
Absolutely. In fact, if you know anything about the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which China claims is a global development and infrastructure project, it's much more notorious than that. That runs through East Turkestan. Without East Turkestan, there is no Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
Even from the economic perspective, right now, the cost of the cost of living in China and the labor has increased substantially. It's not the China of 20 years ago. China is not like that poor developing country anymore. It's a developed country in many standards. Yet, how is it that they are producing these goods so cheaply? How is it that these goods, these cheap Chinese goods are still continuing to flood the global market without
Mm-hmm.
any real competition. It's because they're using the mass slave labor of our people.
Right, right,
The
right,
Chinese
right.
government itself, in its 2020 white paper, because it defends these concentration camps as, vocational training camps,
Mm,
and they're providing us job. They stated in 2020, between 2014 and 2019, that they sent 1.29 million people of our people every single year into so-called vocational training, providing them with job training,
mm,
etc., which is complete bullcrap,
mm,
and providing them, Chinese language training, etc.
mm,
Or roughly 7.8 million people over the course of 6 years. Earlier this year, in January of 2026, the UN experts warned that China's mass forced labor of our people constituted as enslavement as a crime against humanity,
wow.
and stated that China's own white paper, the Chinese government's own directives, 5-year plan from
Mm,
2021 to 2025, instructed the forced labor transfers of 13.75 million people, or
mm,
almost 14 million people, were being enslaved, and it's still doing that.
wow.
It's still going. This is why you're still able to get these cheap goods, because the
Right.
average Chinese people inside China, they're not as poor as they used to be, because China is developed. But the reason this is happening is because of this. And as I mentioned, 90% of the cotton production
Mm-hmm.
in China comes from East Turkestan. So anything that you buy that is made in China that is cotton, most likely that is,
Wow.
that cotton is
Wow.
picked by Uyghur slaves, or the cotton is processed into shirts and other textiles in those internment and slave labor facilities where Uyghurs are being enslaved. So this is the aspect of that part.
Right.
And then if I want to explain how this is colonization, let's look at the demographics um, based on China's own records from
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
1949 versus today. So in 1949, Stalin, in his meeting with Mao, stated, you need to bring up the Chinese population to at least 30%, because the Chinese here are less than 5%. Right now, the Chinese you have there are less than 5%. You need to
Mm,
bring this up to at least 30% in order to ensure that these people don't rise up and that the British and others don't get involved. So this is the thing. Fast forward to 2020. That's the latest, census that China
mm-hmm.
claimed.
Yeah.
They put out a census, and in that they stated that the Chinese population went from less than 5% in 1949 to 42% as of 2020,
Mm,
whereas the Uyghur and other Turkic populations went from over 92% in 1949 to less than to right about 55%, almost
right.
56% in 2020. So this is the worst form of colonization and demographic displacement in this short of a
Mm,
period, in 7 decades in recorded history. You won't
okay.
find anything much more extreme than
Well, I mean, there's,
this.
there's, there's,
Others might try to say,
yeah, I mean, there's quite a few examples that I can cite. Things like, you can talk about the Aboriginal people in Australia, how they were genocide within what 100 years. We could talk about even black people in Brazil, Argentina, particularly Argentina, where black people were wiped out in Argentina within a short space of time. So I get your point, but that's there's also other precedents there that we can look on. But
I know, but what I'm saying, like, because in those occurred like in 100 to 150 years, 200 years, this type of process. But when we are looking at the specific
mm,
replacement of one group by another in this short of a period, like in the modern era, I'm talking about post 1900s,
mm,
you won't find anything more catastrophic as this post
mm.
1900s. Um,
All right,
there's no other example of that. So
sure.
this is the gravest form of settler colonialism in modern history, in like post 1900s.
Right. I mean, we'll talk about a bit more about the oppression, in a minute. But I just wanted to sort of ask. So you talked about the oppression of your people, Uyghur people. So how have they, resisted this colonization, this forced imperialism? How have your people resisted? Have they fought guerrilla warfare? What other tactics have they used to actually resist this form of oppression that you talk about?
So we have consistently resisted since China and the Chinese invaded. In
Mm,
fact, despite the fact that many of our core leaders were killed, our people, our younger junior military officers, they resisted in East Turkestan. The Chinese government itself admits that between since the time that they launched their invasion of East Turkestan in October of 12th of 1949 till January of 1954, that 150,000 of our people were killed, or so-called. The Chinese government describes us as counter-revolutionaries or ethnic nationalists. These are the terms
mm,
that they use, and enemies of China. This is the term that they use. That
mm,
150,000 of them were killed within the first 5 years alone, resisting against the occupation, to the
mm,
point that the Chinese general who Wang Zhen, who was leading the occupation, who's responsible for the occupation, he had actually wanted to completely wipe us out then, and he had requested that more Chinese soldiers be sent so that he could completely wipe us out.
Are you
But
saying
because
are you saying that there was a policy of ethnic cleansing or genocide against your people, or
yeah,
planned?
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, that was the genocide is not something that just happened overnight.
Mm,
It's not something recent. This was their intent from
right.
day one. Because
Right.
Wang
Right.
Zhen, he stated, we need to wipe these people out. And the only
Mm,
thing that prevented him from doing that was actually the Soviet Union. That was the only thing that prevented the Chinese from doing
mm,
that. Was the Soviets. They were still heavily invested in East Turkestan. There were
right.
still, Soviet advisors. There were still Soviet businesses and so
Mm,
forth,
mm,
and they were going to allow the Chinese to completely wipe us out at that time. And because we were the overwhelming majority, it's not like we were just going to remain silent.
mm,
So the Chinese are like, let's bear our time. So we continued resisting in the 19 to the point, as I mentioned, in 1957, 58, over 1,600 of our leaders in the so-called autonomous region were purged because they demanded Chinese colonization and occupation ceased, and that we get our independence back. Then in the 1960s, we had underground resistance. We had an entity called the East Turkestan People's Revolutionary Party, which advocated for armed resistance, and it was preparing for armed resistance across East Turkestan,
right.
and engaged in guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
But it was preparing for a mass one until the Chinese intelligence, using traitors within our people's ranks, managed to subvert that. And the deputy chairman of the so-called autonomous region, or the vice chairman of the so-called autonomous region, General Memtamin Imanov, who's also the vice deputy uh, commander of the so-called Xinjiang military district, it became known that he was the one behind this organization,
Mm,
and this party. So they executed him. Then the movement went underground, but there was still sporadic, armed resistance against Chinese colonial paramilitary and Chinese military forces, up until really the last armed uprising happened in 1990, in April 5th of 1990, and it was brutally crushed.
wow.
And where about several hundred militants, uh, uh, took on over 18,000 Chinese People's Liberation Army troops in
Mm,
a conflict that lasted about a week before the Chinese used overwhelming force,
right.
including aerial bombardments.
Mm,
Then since that, there's been small scale sporadic guerrilla attacks against Chinese military and government personnel. There's been mass protests, but all of them have been brutally suppressed by the Chinese government.
Right.
And especially after September 11, China began to demonize our independence movement. As before, they would call us, initially they called us counter revolutionaries,
Mm.
foreign devils,
Hmm.
barbarians, all these different
Yeah. Yeah.
terminologies, um, and separatists. Then after 9/11, because majority of our people are Muslim, China used
Mm.
this scapegoat of the global war on terror
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
just demonize us as
Yeah.
terrorists. And China, since 2001, has been claiming that it's fighting against terrorism,
Yeah.
and there hasn't been any effective resistance in terms of armed resistance in East Turkestan really since the late 90s, to where right now the only resistance that our people can offer is not inside East Turkestan but externally, by
Mm.
speaking out, by resisting in terms of political means against the Chinese colonization, the genocide, and the occupation.
Sure. I mean, we are running out of time, so I'm definitely gonna have to invite you back for a part two. So in the final minutes, I just want to talk about the the sort of types of repression that the Uyghurs are going through today. So what form of oppression are Uyghurs going through today? And also, how do these camps that you talked about, how do they function? And also, what is their purpose?
So, as I mentioned, after 9/11, China began to demonize us as terrorists. So
And nine
gradually
and
it
nine and
began
nine eleven is
to
obviously the war on terror.
criminalize. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so gradually they began to criminalize every aspect of our identity, not just political resistance.
Mm.
Our language became essentially barred from being taught in schools.
Mm.
Starting in 2003, they introduced the so called bilingual program, which on paper it's bilingual, but in practice it's monolingual, where everyone from elementary till they graduate from high school is strictly Chinese. Before that, we could learn our own language, and then we'd start learning Chinese starting in middle school.
Right. Right.
After that, it just became strictly Chinese. They began to criminalize any form of religious expression and activity. So, no more praying.
Mm.
If you're a young person and you have even this much of a facial hair, you're an extremist, you're a terrorist. These are the basis of why millions of people were taken into the concentration camps.
Right.
They began to forcibly sterilize our population, our
Wow.
women, um, to where the Chinese government's own data, they stated that from 1980s all the way till 2006, 2007, they prevented 3.7 million of our people from being born.
Mm.
So 3.7 million, forced abortions and sterilizations happened during that period. After
Wow.
that, hundreds of thousands of our women have been sterilized. The Chinese government has put up a 0% growth rate for many parts of our country, especially in the south, especially in my hometown as well, um, to reduce with the explicit goal of reducing the Uyghur majority. This is what the
Right.
Chinese government has officially declared. Um, in terms of the mass internment, in fact, this Saturday, May 23rd, marks the uh, 12th anniversary of China officially launching its campaign of genocide.
Wow.
And it'll enter its 13th year. So on May
Wow.
23rd, 2014, China launched the so-called People's War Against Terrorism, or the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism. That's the euphemisms it uses to justify its ongoing genocidal campaign, to where they built over 1,200 concentration camps.
Mm.
By that time, they had already built these camps, so everything was prepared. Initially, they targeted men, young men, men between the ages 15 to 45, those who are
Right. I think I've lost you for a minute. Don't know if the connection's there. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm not sure if So I can hear me, right? So my internet apparently is gone, and I do apologize for that, listeners. The hi, Thea. So yeah, we lost you there for a minute. So
Yeah. Where did it cut off? So
yeah, so you're talking about the the genocide, essentially genocide of the people started in the re-gun of that as of the War of Terror, the campaign since 2014 of the ongoing genocide against the people. So just finalize that, and then we'll wrap up for part one, and then
yeah.
I'll
So
for part two.
so in 2014, they started this campaign. Then initially they targeted the men 15 to 45. The international community, didn't say anything. So China got emboldened, and by 2016, they began sending Chinese officials to our homes.
Wow.
In fact, the Chinese government sent 1.2 million Chinese officials to live in our homes as so-called relatives to monitor our activities, to monitor our loyalties. So they would grade us from 0 to 100. There was like 54 reasons, 48 reasons, that would cause you to lose 10 points each. So these include if you have ever traveled overseas, you automatically lose 10 points. If you have ever believed in a religion, you automatically lose 10 points. If you're a young man and if you're a young man and you're working out, or if you're working out in general, if you have workout equipment, you must be training to become an extremist. So you lose 10 points. If you
Wow.
refuse to drink or drink alcohol, or refuse to eat the pork that they bring you, or you refuse to smoke a cigarette, you're an extremist. If you have more than two babies, you violate the policy, you're an extremist. So these are the reasons. So they would grade us, and the only way you can get 90 or above, which is the safe, if you get 90 or above, you're safe.
Yeah.
Is if you're working for the Chinese state itself. And even in the case that you are, many of the officials that were working, many of them were also interned because they were accused of being two-faced or being disloyal, or because they refused to send our own people to the concentration camps. So by 2019, over 3 million of our people were sent into these concentration camps. To this point, many of our people are still in these camps. We have the
Wow.
most highest incarceration rate in the world, according to the